The year was 2008, and I was 15. It's amazing how the memories we try to forget often etch themselves deeper into our minds. I found no medicine for the past, no solve for the tormenting echoes that haunt the darkest recesses of my memory. And yet, here I am, compelled to share my story. Maybe it's the creeping melancholy that sinks in at night, or the yearning for catharsis, or simply the burden of guilt. I can't say. My parents had an old cabin on the outskirts of Bearsville, a secluded place that I'd loved as a child. But as my teenage years came, I abandoned it in favor of adventures I considered more exciting. When my parents suggested we spend a weekend there, I couldn't say no. They looked too happy at the idea of reliving old times, and so I agreed, even inviting my best friend Kyle to join us. It was an uneventful ride until we reached the winding paths that led to the cabin. Thick rows of pine and oak stood tall on either side, like guardians of an arcane world. As we pulled into the clearing where the cabin stood, I was struck by how different it looked. The once cheerful wooden house was now sunken, time-worn, with windows that looked like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. She might be a little worn, but nothing a fresh coat of paint won't fix, my dad said cheerily, as if he could read my thoughts. My mom looked excited, already planning where to start her little refurbishing project. Kyle and I spent the afternoon exploring, finding the forest just as enchanting as we'd hoped. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. The woods were eerily quiet, and every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something dark, lurking behind the trees. Night came and my parents decided to turn in early. They were old souls trapped in an ever-youthful world, and they valued their sleep. Kyle and I had different plans. We ignited a bonfire, roasted marshmallows, and shared ghost stories. Hours passed and the fire dwindled to smoldering embers. And that's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps. I looked at Kyle and he looked at me. We both knew it wasn't a deer or a rabbit. These footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Maybe we should go back inside, Kyle suggested. Before I could agree, something broke through the tree line. It was tall, skeletal, almost human, but not quite. Its eyes glowed with a bright yellow, and it looked ravenous, its mouth gaping open to reveal row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. Before we could react, the creature lunged at Kyle, tearing into him with a guttural growl. Blood splattered across my face as I watched my best friend's life end in an eruption of gore and screams. I bolted, my primal instincts kicking in. I didn't look back until I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart pounded so hard, I felt it might burst out of my chest. I ran to my parents' room, my mouth open to scream. But what I saw froze the words in my throat. My parents lay there, but not as I remembered them. Their skin was shriveled, hanging loosely off their bones. Their eyes were hollow, devoid of life. I stumbled back, a scream finally breaking free. Then I heard it, the creaking of the front door. I looked towards the hallway just in time to see the creature slither in, its form oozing like a liquid shadow as it reshaped itself into someone familiar. "Sorry for the mess, son," it said, taking on the shape of my father. It's been years since we had such a feast, and we couldn't resist. Terror gripped me, but so did understanding. My parents, no, the creatures that wore their skin, had brought me here for this. For a bloody banquet in the heart of the woods. I was the main course, and Kyle was the appetizer. My quote-unquote father lunged at me, but I dodged, grabbing a lamp from the bedside table and smashing it against his head. It roared in pain, giving me just enough time to sprint out of the room. I made it to the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, not looking back, not caring to know what became of those creatures or the place that was once a sanctuary for my family. When I finally made it back to town, I ran to the police station to tell them what had happened. I could barely form words. I knew they didn't believe me. I hardly believed it myself, and I was there. The police searched the cabin and woods for the bodies of Kyle and my parents, but there wasn't any sign they'd ever been there. After some extensive questioning, one of the officers accompanied me back to my home. As we approached the front steps, the door suddenly swung open, and there stood Kyle and my parents waiting inside. The officer glared at me with a mix of confusion and mild irritation. "Are these your parents, son?" I replied, "Yes, but you know it's against the law to make a false report to law enforcement, right?" I just stood there in silence, staring at the three of them in the doorway. I cautiously retreated while the officer conversed with the individuals posing as my parents, explaining what happened. Deep inside, I held the chilling certainty that these were imposters. Panic surged through my mind, leaving me with only one instinctive course of action: escape. I fled without looking back, determined to never return. I haven't visited Bearsville in more than 15 years. Yet even now, I am haunted by nightmares.